So today let's shift our focus to Massachusetts. In the wake of the Intolerable Acts, the colony was occupied by British troops under the command of General Thomas Gage, who became the royal governor of the colony. Gage was an old America hand. He had served off and on for years in America, and he knew American colonists. Gage was in a position and had the experience to tell Parliament that it was screwing up, and he frequently did so. But Parliament had no desire to listen to him. Gage had an informant inside the Boston Committee of Correspondence by the name of Dr. Benjamin Church, who relayed intelligence to him on rebel activities. Now, we're pretty sure that Church himself was a double agent, that not only did he give intelligence to Gage, but Church also gave intelligence from Gage to the Committee of Correspondence in Boston. Church worked for Gage because he needed the money in order to support his mistress. We're also pretty sure that there was another spy in the governor's mansion, and that spy was Margaret Kimball Gage, General Gage's Philadelphian wife, who apparently carried information from the governor's mansion to the Sons of Liberty in Boston. Now, while in office, Gage told Parliament over and over again that the Troubles were not just the work of a few disaffected rebels, that in fact the freeholders of Massachusetts supported rebellion, and that meant that there were several thousand Massachusetts militiamen in the colony who were solidly on the side of the rebels. Gage told Parliament that England had better be nice to the colonies until enough troops could arrive in Massachusetts. And at least 25,000 more troops, he said, in order to maintain peace in the colony. The government in England decided that Gage was paranoid and a coward. The military leaders in England thought the Americans would not fight. In the midst of this ongoing crisis, Parliament adjourned for Christmas. When they returned, they asked the king to issue a proclamation that stated that the colonies were in a state of rebellion. They also suggested to Gage that he quickly arrest all of the Boston agitators. They warned Gage to do something. The Sons of Liberty intercepted those orders. Gage decided to march to Concord, where, according to Benjamin Church, rebels had stockpiled arms and ammunition. Church had already told Gage where the stuff was. Gage planned the raid in secret. It was possibly the worst kept military secret in the history of warfare. Everybody knew about it. Plain colonists were overheard discussing details and even the strengths and weaknesses of his plan over drinks in Boston taverns. The day before it was to take place, colonists had built fires on high ground between Boston and Concord to light so that as the redcoats passed, a fire would go up to indicate to the local militia units just exactly where the British column was. A small militia unit under a fellow named John Parker mustered the day before on Lexington Green. A messenger from the Sons of Liberty informed Parker that a column of 800 to 1,000 British heavy infantry would probably be marching through Lexington the next morning. Parker was a veteran and he knew that his militia wouldn't have a chance against veteran British professional infantry, so he sent his men home. Then about 1 a.m., Sam Adams and a couple of friends rode into town and had a long talk with Parker. The next morning, Parker mustered his men on the Lexington Green. It's possible that Adams wanted the war to start in the village of Lexington. No one could possibly believe that a small, poorly trained and armed militia would fire the first shot against such odds. So if there were trouble, Adams figured the blame would fall on the British. There was, and it did. One shot was fired as the British entered the village green. The redcoats replied with a volley and charged. Several militiamen were killed. Many were wounded, some shot in the back as they tried to escape the carnage. The British column reformed and continued their march to Concord. After a brief skirmish with the Concord militia, the British located a cannon and some powder and ammunition. Now, this was a siege cannon, huge thing, probably left over from the French and Indian War, and absolutely useless in terms of its use as an artillery piece. No other weapons were found. After a brief skirmish with the Concord militia, the British located the cannon and some powder and destroyed them, and then began to march back to Boston. By this time, the militia from all over the area around Boston had begun to converge on the British troops, and snipers began firing on the British column from cover. British casualties on the march back were very high. In fact, the only thing that saved the column was reinforcements from Boston. They managed to straggle back into Boston under sporadic fire. Once in Boston, overnight, thousands of militiamen converged from all over the colony around what's called the Boston Neck, a little jut of land that connects the town of Boston to the mainland. And essentially, at this point, the British troops were locked into Boston. What began at this point is called the Siege of Boston. Now, while all this was happening in Massachusetts, delegates for the Second Continental Congress were on their way to Philadelphia. When they arrived there, they found that they had a war on their hands. One of their first duties was to create the Continental Army and pick a general to lead it. Congress gave the supreme command to a man who insisted that he didn't want it, but was the only person to show up at the meeting in a military uniform. They gave it to George Washington of Virginia. While debate went on in Philadelphia about what to do, one of the bloodiest battles of the Revolution took place. England still refused to send reinforcements. Instead, they sent 3 new generals. These were among the worst generals that Britain had ever put on the field of battle. Their names were Burgoyne and Clinton and Howe. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British got their chance to destroy the rebels and very possibly end the war with a decisive victory before it had even started. They blew it. The rebels had taken up a position on the heights of what's called the Charlestown Neck, or sometimes the Boston Neck. You'll see it on your map. It connects the city of Boston to the mainland. on the left. Gage recommended that troops be employed to cut the rebels off at the neck and starve them out. Without easy-to-get-to food and water on top of Bunker Hill, it would have been fairly easy to simply starve the Americans into surrender. But Howe was senior officer by actually about 3 weeks, and he ordered a frontal assault up the hill in full pack. Now, a British regimental infantryman carries a pack that weighs 75 to 100 pounds. He also ordered that the British troops use their bayonets rather than rifle volleys to get the colonists off of the top of the hill. He intended to show them what British force looked like. On the first attack, a fair portion of the British infantry was killed. Howe ordered a second with much the same results. Finally, at the request of Gage, he allowed his troops to remove their packs, and the redcoats charged once more up the hill. But by the time they got there, the rebels had simply left. They had run out of ammunition and powder, and they had run back across Charleston Neck to join their comrades on the shoreline. When the whole battle was over, Howe had suffered 35% casualties. Rebel losses were minimal. Although the English called it a victory, after all, they had taken the hill and forced the rebels to retreat. Most of the rebels actually saw through that. They believed that they had successfully stood toe-to-toe with the British in a traditional European-style battle, and they had beaten the British very badly. Now, after Concord, the British had complained bitterly that the rebels violated the rules of war and cheated by hiding behind trees and rocks and shooting redcoats, using the tactics, said the British, of wild Indians. But Bunker Hill had been a set piece, a European-style battle, and the Americans had beaten the British again. The rebels felt exhilarated, and the British were worried. Fighting in the colonies continued for more than a year before the Continental Congress decided in favor of independence. Now, there were a number of reasons for this, so I want to talk about those for a couple of minutes. First, many Americans had a sentimental attachment to the mother country and still had a sentimental attachment to the king. Second, many Americans feared that British rule might be replaced with either anarchy or a despotism, that the American colonists would not be able to come up with a government that worked for themselves. Third, some leaders thought that Parliament might give in and abandon their policies toward the colonies. Colonial merchants were reluctant to lose the trade privileges which they enjoyed under the British flag. Finally, many colonial assemblies, I should say, had failed to give specific instructions to their congressional delegates. These delegates didn't want to take such a great step as separation from the mother country without the consent of their constituents. Now, the clincher that moved enough colonists to support revolution and independence was a pamphlet written by a Philadelphia corset maker named Thomas Paine. The pamphlet was entitled Common Sense, and in it, Paine argued that it was inconsistent to try to pretend to be good British subjects while fighting British troops. For the first time, Paine blamed the king for all of America's misfortunes. Not the Parliament, not corrupt ministers, but the king himself. He blasted the notion of monarchy in general, and George III in particular. Paine wrote, "Monarchy and succession have laid the world in blood and ashes. In England," he said, "a king hath little to do than make war and give away places," in other words, patronage, which in plain terms is to impoverish the nation and set it together by its ears. "Of more worth," said Paine, "is one honest man to society, and in the sight of God, than all the crowned ruffians who ever lived." You get the idea. He called George III the royal brute of Britain. Paine went on to consider the future of America after independence with a Republican government, annual elections, popular representation, a national assembly, prosperity and trade, all the things that would make America a great country. In essence, he sold the American colonists on republicanism, without monarchy. Common Sense was a bestseller. The short pamphlet sold 120,000 copies in 3 months. On the 5th of June, Congress began to debate independence. They had thus moved from defense to treason. 6 delegates threatened to walk out. Congress put off the vote until July 1st, 1776. For 3 days, the Congress deadlocked, and finally, on the 4th day, they resolved their differences and voted for independence. In June of 1776, a committee of the Second Continental Congress, consisting of John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, Robert Livingston of New York, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut, formed a committee to discuss a suitable declaration to frame this resolution for independence. After a great deal of wrangling, it was decided that Thomas Jefferson should be the person to write the document. John Adams said too many people in the Congress disliked him. Franklin was afraid that people would buy whatever he put up for sale, and so it was agreed that young Thomas Jefferson would be the one to write the document. After a series of drafts and edits, the document was presented to the Continental Congress on June 28th. Independence was declared on July 2nd, 1776, pursuant to the Lee Resolution presented by Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, which stated, resolved that these United States are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. The full declaration was rewritten somewhat in general session of the Continental Congress, meeting in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Once finished revising, Jefferson's statement was made on July 1st, and it was signed on July 4th and sent to the printer. So what is the Declaration of Independence? Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration, but what's in it? Maybe start off by saying, what isn't it? It isn't a constitution. It doesn't contain any sort of blueprint for how a government should work. It isn't a declaration of war. You do that before the war starts. It was a declaration of the natural rights of Englishmen in particular and human beings in general. Now, people who lived in the 18th century, thinkers in the 18th century, were very concerned about how they would be perceived by their posterity, that is, the folks who came after them. And this document definitely is an explanation for posterity of why America sought independence. Finally, it gave the rebels, the patriots, if you will, a creed and a loyalty test for their fellow Americans. If you read the Declaration and signed it as a petition, then you agreed with America and God and natural rights, and you were a good patriot. If you read the Declaration and said, I think I'd rather be loyal to the king, then you were a traitor to democracy and God and everything good in the universe, and a loyalist and a Tory, and you would be punished. Now, I like to separate the Declaration into three parts. The first part is called the preamble. The preamble, and it states three Lockean principles of politics and society. First, that all men are created equally under the law. Second, that their Creator gave them certain rights that no one can take away, inalienable rights, among which are the right to life, liberty, and Jefferson said in the first draft, property, which is what Locke said. But then after numerous changes, it was finally changed from property to the pursuit of happiness, whatever the heck that means. Anyway, inalienable rights, a very Lockean idea. Finally, it states that men have an inalienable right to revolution, an inalienable right to overturn any government that tries to threaten those other rights. The second part of the document is what I like to call a list of particulars. Now, the term list of particulars comes from the British common law. When somebody's brought to trial, the first thing the prosecutor does is read off a list of things that the guy did that are illegal. This part is called a list of particulars, and it's a long list of all the bad things that Jefferson said the king did to the colonists. He's essentially reciting a litany of the crimes of the king against America. The last part of the Declaration is a pledge by the signers that they will devote their lives, treasure, and sacred honor to right those wrongs and to achieve independence for America. Now, at this point, we enter into the war itself, and it's for some reason it's fashionable among teachers of American history to spend lots and lots of time on the campaigns and battles of the Revolution, to draw a lot of maps on the chalkboard and talk at length about each and every battle. I think that we will pass on that. The information is in your textbooks if you care to look. Also, my colleague, we always have one colleague in the department who teaches European or military history, and so if you care to know all the details, the gory details of the American Revolution, I'm sure at some point she will teach an American Revolution class. So I'm going to skip all these little details and just try to give a thumbnail sketch of the war, make some comments as it were, and then move on. So let's talk first about the conduct of the war. The Revolution was not so much won by the Americans as lost by the British. In 8 years, there were only about 30 days of actual pitched battle. The British had a logistical nightmare. How, in the age of sail, does a nation supply and reinforce some 120,000 troops who are 3,000 miles away from home? The answer is they don't do a very good job of it. There were frequent reports of starving British troops dressed in rags, waiting for transports from England that either didn't show up or arrived with supplies that were spoiled and cloth that was rotten. The British insisted on combat by European standards, that is, massed fire in ordered ranks. This was devastating in close combat in an open field of battle, and in those areas where such warfare was possible, the British generally won. But much of the war was guerrilla warfare, in which ambush and surprise dominated, and European tactics simply didn't work. The British had allies in America, in the thousands in every colony, the Tories, or if you prefer, the Loyalists, those who stayed loyal to the king, but the British refused to use them. Many Loyalists were veterans of more fighting than the British commanders who refused to employ them. But the British had decided that Americans were untrustworthy, and in the face of all the facts, cowards. So they ignored the Loyalists who were itching to fight alongside the British. The worst problem that the British had was a collection of the most incompetent and stupid commanders that were ever assembled on one side in the war. On the American side, the Continental Army was always tiny, usually very poorly trained, and at any time some fraction was usually AWOL. It amounted to less than 3,000 men on any given day. The quality of the militia varied from place to place. The New England militia was usually very good, and most adult militiamen were hardened veterans of various and sundry Indian wars and even the 7 Years' War. Southern militia was not too good. The Southern militia units were more of a social club than they were anything else. The middle colonies were the worst. The logistics for the American Continental Army wasn't much better than for the British. The Continental Supply Department was riddled with corruption. It was hard to acquire local supplies with Continental paper money because, first off, it was worthless. And second off, if the British caught you with some, then you would hang. Troops were often paid in IOUs, and there were several mutinies. The rebels would never have been able to win without the support of their foreign allies. Ultimately, the war was financed with French and Dutch money, and success was made possible by French support. The war stretched all the way from Maine to Georgia, and it was in Virginia that the war was finally won when American and French troops bottled Lord Cornwallis, the British general, up in the town of Yorktown, the port town of Yorktown. And when British naval vessels came to help get Cornwallis out of a jam, the French were able to keep the naval vessels from arriving in time. General Cornwallis surrendered to George Washington, and the war came to an end. On October 19th, 1781,